Good morning, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. Let me first of all say what a great honor and pleasure it is to be back in Cairo, one of my favorite cities in the world, and how pleased I am that our joint project with IDSC has progressed so successfully over the past couple of years. We have experienced some difficulties, but I'm glad to be able to say that with the support of the Egyptian embassy in Madrid, the Spanish embassy here in Cairo, the Spanish Agency for Cooperation, we have been able to overcome those difficulties. Let me start by saying that I have tremendous respect and admiration for the Egyptian people, their history and culture. And like many people in other parts of the world, I have been following events in Egypt very closely. One could in fact say that the eyes of the world are on Egypt today, because Egypt is an important country in its own right, within the region and within the world as a whole. The last time I addressed this audience, over a year ago, I basically discussed how our knowledge of the Spanish transition could perhaps assist us in understanding other transitions, including the one that's taking place here in Egypt. And what I would like to do today, in order not to repeat myself, is to do something slightly different. I would like to discuss the way in which the international academic community has been responding to events in Egypt, and hopefully I will be able to introduce some concepts and some ideas that may help you analyze what is happening in Egypt and perhaps establish comparisons with the processes that took place in other parts of the world. Let me immediately add that I am just a very modest social scientist. I do not have the answers to many pressing problems. I wish I did. What you can be assured of is that I wish Egypt, its people and its government well, and that my aim is basically to offer general observations and perhaps constructive criticism of some of the events that have been taking place. When the Arab Spring began, a few years ago now, it was greeted with enormous enthusiasm by the international academic community that studies democracy and democratization. And I think one of the reasons why it was greeted with such enthusiasm is that there had been a debate taking place within that community. On the one hand, we had the people, the academics, whom I will describe as transitologists. In other words, experts in transitions to democracy. This school of thought emerged in the 1970s and the 1980s, basically in response to what Samuel Huntington has described as the third wave of democratizations. In other words, the transitions that took place in Portugal, Greece, Spain, later in Latin America, and subsequently in Central and Eastern Europe, and even elsewhere in countries like South Korea and the Philippines. These political scientists, whom we call transitologists, basically argue that democracy can happen any place, any time, regardless of the structural constraints of a particular society. In other words, regardless of a society's level of socioeconomic development, regardless of the role that religion plays in that particular society, regardless of the recent political history of that society. If you will allow me this small joke, to some extent the slogan of the transitologists is like Mr. Obama's slogan, "Yes, we can." In other words, everyone can do it. This, of course, is a very optimistic message, and this partly explains why this school this transitology school has been so popular. However, critics within the academic community and also among practitioners had been arguing for a decade at least that transitologists had gone too far. They had gone too far, in particular, in assuming that transitions are simply the result of free choices made by rational actors. One critic, called Remmer, has written that transition theory had become a retreat into voluntarism. In other words, these critics would argue that the will to carry out a transition is insufficient. Now, initially, the events of the Arab Spring, including events here in Egypt, appeared to prove transitologists right. And as a result, many academics have tried to apply some of the core assumptions of transitology to the study of the Arab Spring and the study of the Egyptian transition in particular. So let me look first of all at what these assumptions are. What are the assumptions underlying the transitological approach? The first assumption is that any country moving away from dictatorship, away from dictatorial rule, can be considered a country in transition towards democracy. Okay, the assumption is that any country that overthrows a dictator is automatically on the road towards democracy. The second assumption is that those underlying structural conditions that I mentioned earlier, like socioeconomic development, will not be major factors either in determining the beginning of the transition or its outcome. The key factor, transitologists have always insisted, is the decision by the country's elites, political elites, to move towards democracy, and the ability on the part of those elites to fend off the contrary actions of remaining anti-democratic forces. Okay, so transitologists have always emphasized the role of political actors, what we normally call agency, and not structural factors. The third assumption is that democratization everywhere, always, unfolds according to the same sequence, according to a series of stages, if you like. The first stage is often described as an opening phase. This is a phase characterized by democratic ferment, political liberalization, cracks which appear in the authoritarian regime, and divisions within that regime. The second phase has just been described as the breakthrough phase. This is basically when the authoritarian regime collapses and new elections are held and a new constitution is adopted. The third phase is what we normally describe as the consolidation phase. In other words, the process whereby the society becomes accustomed to its new democratic institutions. The fourth assumption underlying transitology is the centrality of elections. Now, I'm not claiming that transitologists equate elections with democracy. They are much cleverer than that. They know that democracy is not just about elections. This is what we would normally call the electoral fallacy. But they do believe that elections will dramatically transform the environment in which the country is operating, and above all, will broaden and deepen political participation. The fifth assumption, and this is perhaps a particularly important one, is that the new regime will basically be able to adapt existing state structures without any great difficulty. Adolfo Suárez, the Spanish Prime Minister during the transition years, found that this was actually never the case. And he used a metaphor which I always like to quote. He used to say, how are we expected to keep the water flowing when I'm trying to change the plumbing? At some stage you have to cut off the water in order to change the system. Okay, but doing this simultaneously is a big challenge. The sixth assumption that I wanted to mention this morning is also important and probably of special relevance to the Egyptian case. Transitologists basically assume that transitions take place and are initiated either by the state or by the regime. In the Spanish case is regarded as an example of regime-initiated transition. The Egyptian case is already being considered an example of a state-initiated transition. In other words, the impulse for democratization originated within state structures, the structures of the state that existed already. This, I'm afraid, may be bad news for Egypt if transitologists are correct, because transition literature tells us that transitions initiated from within regimes tend to be more successful and easier to complete than transitions initiated from within the state. So, as I was saying, the international academic community greeted the Arab Spring with enormous enthusiasm, and initially events throughout the countries affected appeared to confirm much of this transitology, much of this transitions literature. However, there has been an interesting change of mood within the last year or so. Things perhaps have not gone quite as smoothly as we had all hoped in Egypt, in Tunisia, and elsewhere. And this has led both academics and practitioners to revisit some of these assumptions. And in this new mood, which is perhaps more sober, we are now often reminded of a number of things which I think are important. First of all, this is something, of course, we already knew, but we are now often reminded of the fact that there are many different roads to democracy. In other words, even if the goal remains the same, even if democracy is basically a universal phenomenon, and therefore one with characteristics which are similar from country to country, in spite of cultural differences, there is a growing understanding that we have underestimated the extent to which there will be diversity along the road to democracy. I would go so far as to say that there is a growing awareness of the idea that a one-size-fits-all approach can actually be counterproductive and can prevent us from actually understanding what is taking place in specific countries. Secondly, we are also increasingly reminded of the fact that the relationship between the type of transition, the nature of the transition, and the resulting regime is also perhaps more complex than transitologists had acknowledged. And indeed, there seems to be a growing awareness of an interesting paradox, namely the fact that similar transitions can actually produce rather different political regimes. Dissimilar transitions can in fact produce rather similar political regimes. In other words, we are not only saying that there are different roads to democracy, but also that the nature of the road, the path taken, can have different impacts on the final product. Thirdly, and this is something which a lot of academics in particular are emphasizing, transitions away from authoritarianism do not always lead to fully fledged democracies. In many cases, they lead somewhere else, somewhere where probably none of us want to end up, in regimes which are sometimes described as illiberal democracies, or semi-democracies, or pseudo-democracies. The author who has studied this phenomenon best is an American political scientist called Thomas Carruthers. And looking back at the last 10 years, he has in fact pointed out that of the 100 or so countries which we considered transitional 10 years ago, only 20 or even fewer are actually en route to becoming successful, well-functioning democracies. Okay, so 10 years ago, political scientists argued that there were about 100 countries which had ceased to be dictatorships and were supposedly moving towards a democratic political system, but in fact, only 10% of them have made it. Sorry, 20% have made it, or are in the process of making it. So this is an important cautionary tale. Most of these 100 regimes today are neither dictatorships nor democracies. They have entered into what Carruthers calls a political grey zone. It's a sort of political limbo in between dictatorship and democracy. And Carruthers identifies two kinds of illiberal democracies, or semi-democracies. One is what he calls feckless pluralism. The other he calls dominant power politics. I don't want to waste too much time on this, but I do want to describe them very briefly. So these are two different models of illiberal democracies or semi-democracies. The feckless pluralism kind is a system where you have significant pluralism, political pluralism, you have some freedom, you have elections, even alternation in power, different parties having access to power. But democracy in these societies remains shallow. Governments come and go, but there is very low political participation. Political elites are often perceived as corrupt, self-interested, ineffective. And the public is basically disaffected from politics. The other model, the dominant power model, is different because basically there is no alternation in power. The same group of people remain in office. Sometimes it's a political movement, sometimes it's a political party, sometimes it's a coalition of interest groups. And the main difference, the main feature of this model is that there is a blurring of the distinction that should exist between the regime and the state. Okay, this distinction disappears. The regime and the state become one and the same thing. And in this dominant power block model, the people who are in government, they control the state as a provider of social peace, because they control the army and the police, as a provider of income and jobs, because they control the treasury, as a provider of public information, because they control the media, and as a provider of justice, because they control the judiciary. So these are countries where there is no alternation in power. There are elections, even free elections to some extent, and the organized opposition tends to be weak. Okay, so sadly these are two types of political system, the feckless pluralism and the dominant power bloc, which have become increasingly common in recent years. We find, for example, a lot of the former Soviet republics in these categories. Okay, so let me move now on to a different topic, which is how this international academic community is reviewing events in Egypt or studying events in Egypt and trying to adapt some of these ideas to events here. I think the first general comment to make is that transitologists probably underestimated the obstacles that existed in Egypt's path to democracy. As you all know far better than I do, Egypt has experienced severe economic difficulties, social polarization, acute political violence, and even acts of terrorism. However, let me reassure you, this is by no means unique to the Egyptian transition. Transitions almost everywhere have been characterized by conflict and by uncertainty. This is, in fact, a defining feature of any transition to democracy. Now, understandably, many Egyptians are probably suffering from politics fatigue. You have had a very significant number of elections and referenda in a short period of time. I fear there may be a real danger that this may be translating into a democracy fatigue, and it would be a great shame if this were the case. The current yearning for stability, the current demand for stability, which one perceives almost everywhere in Egypt today, may be leading some to think that Egypt is not ready for democracy, and indeed may be leading some to think that democracy will inevitably lead to chaos. And this, of course, easily leads to another assumption, namely that only a very strong leadership, even perhaps an authoritarian leadership, will prevent this. So let me comment on some of these notions. First of all, the empirical evidence suggests that this kind of authoritarian response would only be a short-term and ultimately counterproductive answer to deeper structural problems. And I want to address one notion in particular, this idea that Egypt may not be ready for democracy. It is, of course, directly associated with the notion that less developed countries cannot afford democracy. And my point here is that the current difficulties that you and other countries in the region are experiencing should not lead us to swing away from the voluntarism and the optimism of the transitological approach towards a very structurally determined interpretation of how democratization takes place. And I would like to stress 3 points, which I hope will illuminate what I'm saying a little bit better. The first key point is that less developed countries can develop democratic regimes. Less developed countries are not condemned to authoritarian rule. Some of my colleagues often quote Bangladesh as the most extreme example of this. Bangladesh, which only has a GDP per capita of $752, is admittedly only partly free, but is making progress along the road to democracy. But we have a far better example, India. GDP per capita of $1,489. And perhaps an even more relevant one from where we are standing today, Indonesia. GDP per capita of $3,557, a population of 241 million, the largest, in fact, Muslim democracy in the world. Let me remind you that Egypt's current GDP per capita is $3,256. So it's quite similar to Indonesia and far higher than the GDP per capita of India. You also have literacy rates which are higher than those of India. So my point here is basically that it would be wrong to succumb to this sort of determinist pessimism. My second point is the relationship between regime type and economic performance is complex. It is not linear. Admittedly, democracy does not automatically guarantee economic growth. We wish it did. But nor does authoritarianism. And this is something to keep in mind. If anything, studies suggest that democracy does foster economic growth much more than it hinders it. Basically, because it allows societies to be more dynamic, and because political freedom and economic freedom often go hand in hand. There are many more poor dictatorships than there are poor democracies. The third point here is that transitologists, in my view, were always correct in stressing the importance of political elites and political craftsmanship. Look at Tunisia today. After numerous setbacks, which have included the assassination of prominent political leaders, Tunisia is now poised to adopt a new constitution which enjoys the support of all major parties. I think this would suggest that structural factors are not to be exaggerated in their importance. The gap in Tunisia between the secular and the Muslim parties has been successfully bridged. Let me move on to a slightly broader, more conceptual remark about the need to be realistic and, I think, specific about what democracy can and cannot deliver. But it may be useful in this regard to force ourselves to think more carefully about what we mean by democracy, what we actually mean when we talk about transitions to democracy. You, of course, know far more about this than I do, but my impression, talking to Egyptians and reading about Egypt today, is that when Egyptians refer to democracy, they are normally referring to 5 different notions, or 5 different dimensions of this concept. The first, democracy understood as representation. This is probably the most obvious meaning that we all give to democracy. Democratic elections allow us to determine who is entitled to govern, who can take decisions on behalf of the people. However, even very popular governments everywhere in the world never win the support of the vast majority of the population. Many voters will always support other parties, or perhaps won't even bother to vote at all. Let me remind you what happens in the United States. In 2012, President Obama won 51% of the vote. About 66 million people supported him, but 61 million people voted for his rival, Mitt Romney, and about 50 million abstained. The turnout was only 54%. That means that about 110 million Americans did not vote for President Obama. But we still call America a democracy. The point I'm trying to make is that representative democracy necessarily entails respect for those who did not vote for you. And this, no doubt, is something that the former Egyptian president clearly ignored, or forgot if he ever knew it. Majorities, however large, are very rarely permanent, and therefore the respect for pluralism and minorities is always a key component of any democratic system. The second meaning which I detect in current Egyptian discourse is the idea of democracy understood as the ability of personal and collective freedoms. In other words, democracy as freedom from tyranny. And I would argue that the Egyptian revolution is irreversible in this regard. I would argue that Egyptians have become accustomed to a level of personal and collective freedom which will guarantee that they will never tolerate any kind of dictatorship in the future. Let me also stress, though, that the defense and effective guarantee of those freedoms is always a crucial challenge in any democratic transition. I would say that the three basic freedoms that are most at stake in a democratic transition are the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of association. And if those are undermined, then the transition itself will be in trouble. The third meaning that I often detect in the way in which Egyptians think and talk about democracy is its socio-economic dimension. In other words, democracy understood in terms of social justice and equality. At the very least, equality of opportunity. And I think the notion of dignity, which has been very present in the Arab Spring revolutions, is also a part of this. And it is totally understandable that people should believe that they are, if they are equal in terms of their political rights, they should also be more equal in terms of their access to public goods, such as health and education. Therefore, any effective and legitimate Egyptian democracy will have to address this question, this socio-economic dimension. The fourth meaning of democracy is democracy understood as accountability. I think most of you would agree with me if I say that one of the reasons, the causes of the revolution was the rejection of institutions and officials who act as though they are unaccountable. This also, of course, played a key role in the overthrow of the former president. And therefore, I think that future governments in Egypt will have to continue to stress this notion of democracy as accountability. Fifthly, another element which I think is common to today's Egyptian discourse is democracy understood as a way of restoring justice. The recognition of equality before the law should, of course, lead, many people would believe, to the redress of old injustices. In other words, democracy understood as a broader process of correcting past wrongs. This in the literature, of course, is associated with the concept of transitional justice. I understand there is a ministry for transitional justice in Egypt today. My main point would simply be, having studied cases all over the world, that transitional justice must always be about justice, not about revenge. Otherwise, it will simply generate new injustices. And there is a very interesting academic and theoretical debate about the relationship between transitional justice and national reconciliation. And indeed, about the sequence with which these phenomena, or in which these phenomena take place. I would argue that in Spain, we had national reconciliation first, and then the transition. To some extent, the transition was the expression of a previously achieved national reconciliation. But in other countries, the transition has taken place first, and it is the successful transition which has allowed the subsequent national reconciliation to take place. I wouldn't presume to express an opinion on how Egyptians should handle this issue. It is an extremely complex one. The final point I want to make with regard to these ideas about democracy is that there is a crucial dimension of democracy which is perhaps sometimes forgotten, and that is the notion of democracy as a problem-solving method. And this is why I argued earlier that we have to be realistic about what democracy can achieve. Our societies are all very complex. Some problems will never be solved. We have to accept this. A lot of social and economic problems do not have a solution, or at least not an easy short-term solution. And the only way to deal with these deep social, economic, religious, ethnic cleavages that may exist in our societies is through democratic, peaceful democratic coexistence. So my point here is simply that a functional approach to democracy is sometimes the most pragmatic and the most constructive. That's why I mentioned the idea of democracy as a problem-solving mechanism. a way to deal with conflict in a civilized manner. I want to make two very brief remarks about the situation in Egypt today, if you will allow me, and please understand that I am doing this in a totally constructive manner. Well, 3 points about the new constitution and its future implementation and possible consequences. The first point about the constitution that I would like to make is that the new text is undoubtedly the most democratic and liberal constitution that Egypt has ever adopted. And this is a very significant collective achievement of which Egyptians should be proud. However, the point, of course, about constitutions is not what they say in writing. The key issue is their implementation. And respect for the constitution that you have all just adopted will, of course, be crucial. I think the constitution makes very significant progress, remarkable progress in some areas, the recognition of rights of individuals, women, minorities, and this, I think, is something that should be generally accepted, both in Egypt and abroad. Of course, there will continue to be doubts about the way in which the constituent process was run and the way in which the constitution was written. That happens in many transition processes. In my view, the key challenge in the future will be that of inclusiveness. In other words, the ability of the constitution to act as an umbrella under which all Egyptians can feel comfortable and under which all Egyptians are guaranteed participation in the political system and also in the benefits of the Egyptian economy and Egyptian culture. Second point I want to make about the constitution, and I think there is no problem in acknowledging this, is that it has created what transitologists would describe as reserved domains. The transitions theory stresses that in transitions which were initiated from within the state, some state institutions, most commonly the armed forces, will try to guarantee some of their traditional rights, some of their traditional privileges during the transition process in order to protect those institutions from unforeseen consequences. In fact, some of these reserved domains existed in other earlier Egyptian constitutions. The most evident reserved domain in the new constitution is the military reserved domain, and you all know the text of the constitution far better than I do. But this is evident, for example, in the provision allowing the armed forces to appoint defense ministers during the first 2 presidential terms, Article 234. It is evident in the fact that the Parliament will have no control over the military budget, Article 203. And it is also evident in the provisions extending military jurisdiction over civilians, Article 204. Now, what I want to stress is that these reserved domains are by no means unique to the Egyptian situation. Reserved domains have been included in other transitional constitutions. It happened in Portugal, it happened in Brazil, it happened in Chile, and elsewhere. And the point I want to stress here is that these constitutions were subsequently amended once democracy had progressed further, and in order to ensure that these institutions did not enjoy undue autonomy. The third point I want to make about the constitution is an interesting paradox, and that is that the new political system will be semi-presidential. So there is a bit of an irony here. I think a lot of people would like to see a strong president taking office soon, after having been democratically elected, of course. But it's important to stress that the new constitution has actually attempted to limit the powers of the future president. and the future president will have to work very closely with the next parliament and, of course, with his future prime minister. So I think Egypt is entering uncharted waters in the sense that this is a break with its political culture and some of its political traditions. Let me conclude with a final general point. The nurturing and the development of democracy, as the ambassador mentioned earlier, is a gradual process. It's a process which takes time. But the point I want to make is that political stability, economic development and security will only emerge in a context which advances towards a more inclusive form of governance. And this in turn will require Was it something I said? This in turn will require progress in what the Spanish political scientist Juan Linz, who sadly passed away last October, described as the 5 spheres of democracy. His argument is that democracy, of course, is much more than just about elections. Democracy is about 5 spheres. And progress in those 5 spheres will take time. They will not occur simultaneously, and they will not occur automatically. The first sphere is the rule of law. I don't have to stress that a democratic system of government cannot exist without the rule of law. And I think that popular perceptions of the shortcomings of the rule of law in Egypt partly explain the events that we have witnessed over the last months and years, and they need to be addressed. Secondly, what Juan Linz described as a well-regulated, legitimate economic society. This is an interesting concept, economic society. By economic society, we mean the institutions, the laws, the regulations, and the practices which govern a modern economy. And we all know that the Egyptian transition is taking place in a very difficult domestic and international economic context. Sadly, this too is very common to many transitions. Unfortunately, reality doesn't stop so that we can face one problem at a time. In many other transitions in other parts of the world, economic crisis has taken place simultaneously with the political process of change. Thirdly, a dynamic, autonomous civil society. And our friends and colleagues in the IDSC mentioned this in their opening statement. The future quality and resilience of Egyptian democracy will depend largely on the strength and autonomy of civil society. We have witnessed the importance of this in Tunisia. It was largely organizations within Tunisian civil society which forced the political parties to reach a solution, a consensus concerning the new constitution. Fourthly, a legitimate, stable, and effective political society. And by political society, we mean the institutions, the laws, and the practices which make us a legitimate, stable, and effective political system possible. The key element here, of course, are political parties. And everyone I talk to in Egypt tells me that the big challenge remains the creation of strong, representative political parties. There cannot be political representation without these institutions. So the creation of broad-based, representative and credible parties, I would say, is probably one of the biggest political challenges that is still facing Egypt today. Finally, and perhaps most importantly in some ways, a legitimate, effective state. One of the most important, I think, critiques that has been made of the transitology school is that it did not sufficiently take into account the challenge of reforming the state at the same time as reforming political institutions. So in countries where corruption, unfairness, and inequality have played a significant role in the process leading to regime change, the debate about the future role and nature of the state will continue to play a major part in the democratizing process. And therefore, finally, I conclude with the point that the democratization of the Egyptian state is probably also one of the biggest challenges that lie ahead. Now let me finally say that of course many other countries have also faced this challenge, Spain included. And as we look to the next stage of our partnership with our Egyptian friends, which I am very much looking forward to, perhaps this is precisely what we should center our attention on. Thank you very much indeed for your interest.